Thank you and good evening and welcome to the inaugural Patty Isacson Sabee Word Fellow Lecture. I'm Ann Friedman, the founder of Planet Word, and the very smart person who hired Patty Isacson Sabee to be the first executive director of Planet Word. She was by my side from the earliest days of planning and imagining this museum concept. Immediately after our search team's initial interview, I knew we didn't need to look any further because Patty perfectly embodied all the attributes we were seeking. She was a proven museum administrator. She had overseen construction of a building. She was a word person with a background in publishing. She was from Iowa, like me. And she had gone to Grinnell College, like my mom. And she had worked with a founder. So she would know how to handle demanding people. Starting in March 2017, we worked together nonstop to hire exhibit designers and test prototypes of every exhibit experience, and to hire a production company to build and install those exhibits. She built a top-notch team to staff Planet Word. She worked tirelessly to set up the operations and financial records that any serious organization had to have. And she saw Planet Word through the grand opening during COVID and into its first 3 years of operations. So when Patty decided to return to her first love, working in music and the arts, I knew she should take that opportunity. She had devoted more than 6 years of her life to building Planet Word into a functioning, successful museum, and it was time for her to climb one more mountain, this time with the Detroit Opera. But I wanted to honor everything that she had done for me and for Planet Word, so I thought that creating a Word Fellowship in her name would be just the right thing. Which brings us to tonight with Patty joining us, so please stand up, Patty. To hear from the esteemed journalist Judy Woodruff speaking on a topic that is core to her type of sensitive reporting and to Planet Word's belief that people should use their words to understand one another and to build a stronger democracy. Judy is a senior correspondent and the former anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. She has covered politics and other news for 5 decades at NBC, CNN, and PBS. For the last 2 years, Judy has undertaken a special reporting project. She's traveled across our diverse and broad country, interviewing all sorts of Americans about whether they felt their country was hopelessly divided or whether there was still a shared national vision. Because of her travels and conversations, Judy is probably in a better position than almost anyone to tell us what she has learned about the state of America and whether using our words wisely can help us forge a shared future. Her series, called America at a Crossroads, will continue for at least 1 more year, and we can all trust that her reporting, airing on WETA, will continue to enlighten us and help us build empathy for our fellow citizens. So I want to welcome Judy to the stage and thank her for being here tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ann Friedman. I am beyond thrilled to be here at the place I call Ann's baby. Planet Word, this amazing place, and I am confident there's no place like this in the entire world. I haven't checked out the whole world, but I think I'm right. And I am incredibly honored to be asked to deliver the inaugural lecture in the name of Patty Isacson Sabee, your first executive director. And I know from reading about Patty, I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, I'm going to do that this evening, that she was and she is today one of America's most transformative, imaginative, and talented leaders in the arts world, known for her efforts to open arts experiences to more diverse participants and to far more diverse audiences. Her contributions during her more than 6-year tenure, as Ann just said, here at Planet Word, did truly help you bring your long-held dream to life. A place that celebrates words and language in the city, as you put it, Patty, that celebrates the great words that built our democracy and our country. Realizing that you will, of course, continue to innovate and update in the years to come, experiencing Planet Word today is seeing Ann Friedman's dream come true. Congratulations to everyone who helped make it possible. Congratulations. And to everyone in the audience, thank you. There is a lot going on right now in the nation's capital, and I think down in South Florida somewhere. So I especially appreciate your being here tonight. We come together this evening, less than 2 weeks after another of the most important milestones in our democracy, electing a new president and members of Congress who will be making critical decisions about the direction we take as a country over the next few years. It turns out about 155 million Americans went to the polls, fewer than 4 years earlier. Another 90 million Americans who were eligible to vote stayed home. We don't know what their preferences are. Officially, the results were unambiguous. Former President Trump won almost 60% of the Electoral College, giving him wind at his back as he unfolds an ambitious agenda for his second term. On the other hand, the popular vote margin of victory was tiny. It's calculated that when all the votes are counted, and they're not yet, former President Trump will take just under 50%. And because the focus of my reporting for the past 2 years has been on the American people, trying to understand, as Ann said, what they are thinking, how we are so divided, and why, that is what I have keyed on, where the American people are coming from. There's expected to be less than a 1.7% difference between the vote for Vice President Harris and that for former President Trump, telling us that the division we have witnessed over the past almost decade hasn't gone away. After this long, bitter, and hard-fought campaign, the American people have switched majorities, but they are no less divided than we were. We may be more divided. Ann first reached out to me in April, and if I ever hope to be able to say to you this evening in November that our divisions were easing, that unlike a few years ago, political discourse had been raised to a higher level, and that Americans were growing more accepting of people with different views than their own, those hopes have now receded. What I can share with you tonight are my main takeaways from the past 21 months leading up to this election, traveling the country, talking with ordinary Americans, community leaders, some scholars, and others. This project, which we have called America at a Crossroads, is something that I very much wanted to do and had been planning for after I stepped away from the anchor desk at the NewsHour at the end of 2022. Why? Because in all my years of covering American politics, going back to the Georgia legislature in the 1970s, and having covered Washington since the Jimmy Carter administration, I had never seen the American people as divided as they are today. Eminent historians from Drew Faust to Doris Kearns Goodwin to Michael Beschloss all suggest our divisions are the worst since the Civil War. With families not able to sit together over Thanksgiving dinner, neighbor stopped speaking to neighbor, Facebook pals being unfriended, and relationships ending between longtime college and school friends. I wanted to understand what was behind this, how deep it runs. I wanted to visit communities, to hear from the American people themselves, something I couldn't do sitting behind a desk, living in the bubble that is Washington, D.C. And as much as I love my hometown, and I do love this city, and I respect the great work that goes on here by government employees, public policy experts, my fellow journalists, and so many others, many of us, me included, have lost touch with how Americans are living, what most Americans, what their daily lives are like, how they view the nation's capital, and what their priorities are. And that's what my team and I have been trying to understand. We've learned over the months that there are many complex layers to our division. The place where we grew up, the church we go to, how much education we have, race, economic inequality, and resentment that some are being given an unfair advantage, including immigrants, fear of those who are different, technology, the media, how our leaders speak and what they say, and more. In our travels to 26 states, from Oregon, where rural residents in the eastern part of the state went to Idaho, they want to join Idaho next door, to Florida, where we spent the day with the founders of the We the People Health Clinic, opposed to the COVID vaccine and deeply suspicious of the nation's public health system. From Arizona, where we sat with two Hispanic Americans, don't live very far apart from one another in Phoenix, one very pro-Trump, the other fiercely liberal Democrat. From there, we went to rural northwestern Pennsylvania, where we met once friendly neighbors and local public school board members, now deeply split over banning books with any LGBTQ reference, no matter how mild, and a plan to prohibit all transgender women high school students from participating in athletics, even though there are no transgender women high school students in the entire district. We also visited the city where I was born, Tulsa, Oklahoma, to talk with their young Republican mayor, for the first time trying to address the aftermath of the 1921 Greenwood Massacre, when white citizens firebombed from planes flying overhead an entire prosperous Black neighborhood, killing scores and burying the history for almost a century. He was facing pressure from Black citizens who want cash reparations, and a group called Moms for Liberty who don't want the history of race in Oklahoma or all of America to be taught in a way that makes school children feel uncomfortable. Which raises the question, how do you teach history if you don't teach all of history? We also wanted to highlight some efforts being made to bring people together, including places where those efforts haven't succeeded, to learn what's standing in the way. We visited Tennessee in the aftermath of a terrible elementary school shooting in Nashville, where 3 9-year-olds and 3 teachers were killed. We wanted to talk with some of the 11 Tennessee citizens brought together by an outside nonprofit group called Starts With Us. It's a great name, that works to bridge extreme division in communities. Despite the fact that these 11 people span the political spectrum, they included both fierce Second Amendment advocates, even the owner of a gun range in rural Tennessee, as well as a school teacher from inner city Memphis who has lost students to shootings. Only 10 of the 100 members of the Republican majority Tennessee state legislature showed up for a briefing on these modest recommendations from this group for gun safety. And the gun rights advocates in the Tennessee 11, as the group was called, received life-threatening messages accusing them of being liberal plants. Their proposal went nowhere. Those are just snapshots. You can find, and this is a plug, all of our reports in the town hall we put together in Milwaukee in September with people from across the political spectrum to hear what was on their minds, how they were viewing our divide. You can find them all on the NewsHour's website or on our YouTube playlist. But the thread running through all of this reporting was an attempt to understand not only what all these divisions were about, but also to understand how people think about people on the other side of the divide. What are some of the words they use? When we started out, we checked in at the nonpartisan, highly respected Pew Research Center here in Washington. Their experts showed us that public opinion polls of 30 years ago, back in the early 1990s, if the American people at that time were, say, this far apart on big issues like government spending, immigration, abortion, today they said we are this far apart. We have truly grown more to the extreme in our opinions. But what was more striking, they shared surveys that showed opinions by Americans about people in the other political party have significantly darkened over the decades, and even more recently. Example, in 2016, 47% of Republicans said yes when they were asked if they agreed with the description of most Democrats as immoral. Today, that figure is 72%. For Democrats, there's been almost as pronounced an increase from 35 to 63%. Almost identical answers when Republicans were asked then and now if they think Democrats are, quote, dishonest. Afterwards, we spoke with a political scientist who studies political psychology. Her name is Liliana Mason, Johns Hopkins University. I hardly recommend her books to you. She's written several. But her research shows how increasingly Americans have merged our political identity into our personal identity. That in the current media environment, as we are surrounded by often, by reminders of who is on what side, when opinion, even conspiracy theory, too often carries more weight than fact-based information, people are increasingly identifying themselves first and foremost, and each other, by what party they belong to. So that when we interviewed a group of Republican and Democratic voters in Iowa and Pennsylvania, respectively, we found they have pretty harsh views of people on the other side. Two-time Trump voters in Iowa told us they feel labeled by Democrats, even by their own family members. When we asked them what they would think if their son or daughter married a Democrat, one woman replied, "My daughter did. It didn't go well." There was some smiling around the table, but then she said, "We're now estranged." In fairness, a few said they would accept it, that they already have children who disagree a lot with them, but they still love each other. And yet others described painful divides in their families. And when we asked those Iowa Republicans if they thought Democrats could be people of deep faith, deep Christian faith in particular, every member of one of our focus group circles said no. When we asked them why, they said they didn't think it was possible to be a Christian and to believe that abortion is acceptable. They also brought up LGBTQ. They singled out transgender individuals. One panelist said, "God made us. He knows your gender at birth. It's not possible for you to change it." When soon after that, we interviewed a focus group of Democratic voters in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and we shared the comments of what the Republicans had said about Democrats, about how it wasn't possible to be a person of deep faith, to be a Christian and a Democrat. The reactions were at first to shake their heads, say that's words to the effect, that's ridiculous, and to describe how in their belief, Jesus accepted all people, how he cared for the poor, the sick, and those who were different. One described the Iowa Trump voters, and I'm quoting, as almost like a cult where he's Jim Jones and they're drinking the Kool-Aid, and nothing you can say or do will turn them around. So we're talking about two groups of people, Americans, different parts of the country, but with very different outlooks. Another noteworthy thing about those Des Moines, Iowa Republican voters we spoke with, where do they get their news? One woman told us she watches Blaze TV and Fox News, and she uses Truth Social as well as Twitter, along with her local NBC station, TV station. Another mentioned Clay Travis and Buck Sexton, who took over Rush Limbaugh's talk radio show. And that gentleman said, these guys, they look into things, they know things. He added that Sean Hannity of Fox News is really good too. This is where they get their information. This tracked with reporting we did later in a Boston suburb, interviewing two women who live just a mile or so apart, but they get their news from very different places. One only watches Fox News Channel, or Newsmax, she told us. The other pretty much only watches MSNBC and CNN. You won't be surprised to know the Fox viewer was wholeheartedly for Trump and cited terrible crimes being committed by undocumented immigrants, while the MSNBC and the CNN viewer, who said she also does watch some of what we call mainstream news on the commercial networks, spoke of the positive contributions by immigrants. It is clear we are now living in a polarized news environment. Try, as those of us working in the mainstream news organizations might, to be as fair and as fact-based as we possibly can. The news organizations on the right accuse us of having a leftist agenda, and their massive audiences largely believe this. Trust in the news media has plummeted from what it was in the days of Walter Cronkite. And this has come at a time when the business model of journalism is under great strain, when thousands of newspapers have gone out of business just across the country over just the last several years, the decade or so. Tens of thousands of journalists have been laid off. Now that people can get their news for free, now that technology has shortened our attention spans, many Americans have decided it's not worth paying for a subscription, with, of course, a few outstanding exceptions like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. A reporter I've known for a long time named Mike Tomasky wrote a piece in the New Republic last week, concluding that this election proved that not just cable news, but talk radio, social media, and podcasts, which you've heard a lot about lately, much of which he lumps under the heading of right-wing media, now sets the news agenda in this country. He wrote, "This is the year in which it became obvious that the right-wing media have more power than the mainstream media." Whether he's correct or not, there is no question that what conservative media serve up is being consumed by vast numbers of Americans. This country began with a heavily opinionated press. After the Constitution guaranteed freedom of the press, both political parties at the time sponsored newspapers, to reach their partisan followers. Fast forward to 1900, the era early at the end of the 19th century, newspapers were filled with sensational stories, muckraking journalism, as well as some serious and objective reporting. By the middle of the 20th century, the country had exploded with award-winning print journalism. We think of the Watergate reporting done by the Washington Post, so much more. Walter Cronkite was seen as the most trusted man in America. It is safe to say that today there is no Walter Cronkite, or Huntley Brinkley, for that matter, for those of us who remember them. All this matters. Why does it matter? Because it has contributed to our divisions. We can go to our respective corners now to get the news that agrees with us and never hear what the other side hears. And in too many cases, it ends there. Many Americans never hear the whole story, never hear all the facts that make up a story or the context in which a story takes place. An example that is still fresh in our minds is the rumor started this fall that Haitian immigrants living in a small city in Ohio were eating people's pets. Local officials, law enforcement, the Republican governor of Ohio, and others all stated that this was not true, that there was no evidence at all to back it up. Even so, public opinion polls showed that more than half of Trump voters, people who said they intended to vote for Trump, said they believed it to be true. Another quarter said they weren't sure, while almost 9 in 10 people who said they were likely to vote for Kamala Harris told pollsters they thought it false. This was a story repeated frequently by former President Trump and his vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance, and it was amplified by the news media who support them. There are many other examples of claims about immigrants, about crime, about COVID that were repeated over and over, despite lack of evidence or any evidence to the contrary. And by the way, this is not to say that mistakes are never made, that there are never exaggerations to make a point. By the mainstream media, we make mistakes. But when we make them, we should correct them, and we try to do that. That is certainly our approach at the NewsHour. We hate mistakes. We were taught to hate mistakes. But when they happen, we publicly apologize. We are as transparent. We should be as transparent as we can be and issue a correction. Get it out there as soon as possible. What the public sees, however, is often different from that. Many have given up on the news media they grew up with. They get their news from whatever pops up on the news feed on their device, or what a friend wrote on Facebook, or whatever social media they subscribe to. So it's no wonder that Americans operating in different information spheres have different, often profoundly different views. Years ago, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. Today, sadly, that seems antiquated. And as long as we have leaders in this country who don't share the need to pursue facts, who are comfortable exaggerating, even distorting information, it's going to be hard to work our way through this division. But we must try. There is too much at stake, far too much at stake for us to throw up our hands and give in to false narratives, thinking there's nothing we can do. I pursued this reporting project, and I'm going to continue to pursue it, as Ann said, next year, focusing on people and groups around the country who are looking for solutions. If anyone out here has a suggestion, please come up to me after the program tonight. Let me know. I'm quite serious. I'm doing this, though, out of a belief that we are stronger as a country if we are able to listen to each other, find the words to speak to each other that will make us want to work together, to hear each other, to work together despite our differences. We are stronger, I believe, if we respect others with whom we disagree and not reject them or look down on them. And I realize that's a reach. When we perceive what the other side is trying to do will harm our country and harm the American people. But to the extent we recognize there are some important things upon which we will never compromise, but there are others in which we can find common ground, and if both sides are operating in good faith, we must keep working to hold up facts and hold up the truth. That is the basis of our democracy, our democratic experiment. And at a time when democracies are under strain around the world, when many people are being lulled into thinking autocracy is an easier, better solution, we more than ever need to hold fast to our ideals. And I have reasons to believe that, reasons to have hope. The longtime head of Special Olympics, Tim Shriver, son of Sarge and Eunice Shriver, many of you may know him. He's the nephew of President Kennedy. He's launched a nationwide project he calls the Dignity Index, urging every American to take what he calls the Dignity Pledge. It reads simply, "As an American who knows and loves my country, I am convinced there is no America without democracy, no democracy without healthy debate, and no healthy debate without dignity. Therefore, I pledge to do more to treat others with dignity, not contempt." A professor at the University of North Carolina, Keith Payne, has just written a book called Good, Reasonable People. I recommend it. He examines why people are so divided, in which At the end of the book, he urges all of us to remember our differences are probably exaggerated because we don't spend time together. We probably think the other side has more extreme positions than they actually do. He also urges us to learn to see each other two ways at once. First, as individuals doing our best to make sense of the world, quoting Abraham Lincoln, he does, who said of the Southerners, they are just what we would be in their situation. But at the same time, he says, we should view each other as opponents in a contest that matters. The point of remembering view number one, he writes, is that it allows us to fight about view number two with words and ballots rather than blood and bullets. It was Abraham Lincoln, speaking before and after the Great Civil War, who also called on us to bring forward, you know it, the better angels of our nature. And then after the war, he said to have malice toward none and charity for all. And that brings us full circle to something Patty Isacson Sabee said early on when she was asked about her and Anne's goal for Planet Word. She wrote and said, we share the desire to make reading cool again and to connect people with the agency and power to enjoy and be thoughtful with their words and their language. And everything that comes with that, empathy for others and the ability to create joyful experiences, have civil dialogue, and support a democratic society. Words so apt for this moment. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. So honored. Thank you.
If anyone has questions for Judy Woodruff, please raise your hand.
Raise your
We'll
hand.
come
We'll have
around
a
with
microphone.
microphones.
Somebody on the front row, right here. And I think I see a hand way in the back, too. Hi.
Thank you so much. I'm sure many people here are big fans of public broadcasting, both television and radio. And how are you assessing your position in these polarized times? What are you guys doing?
Well, we're doing a couple of things. Number one, we are determined to always remember who we are. In the case of the NewsHour, to remember our founders, Jim Lehrer and Robert McNeil, who any of you who've watched the NewsHour for years know they started the program in 1975 with the belief that Americans could understand complex stories and news, and that the American people deserve to hear more of a story rather than less. So they for the first, I guess, 7 or 8 years, they did a half-hour program, and they spent the whole half hour on one subject. And then in 1983, they expanded it to a full hour, but with the intention of spending time on each story and treating stories seriously and treating the audience with respect. So that's staying true to our mission is a central part of what we do. At the same time, let's be honest, we're in a different world now when it comes to the politicians we're covering. In the past, we were all used to covering politicians who want to come across the best way they possibly can. They want to polish their resume. They want to make it sound as if everything they've done was the best thing that could have possibly been done. A little exaggeration here and there. But we're in a moment now where statements are being made that just are false by politicians, both at the presidential level and by members of Congress, governors, others. So what that has meant for us, and I'll say it took us, I'd say, a period of time during the first Trump administration, first term, to figure out how to talk about it, because it was not something we were used to doing. How to talk about, how to say, to quote something the president or a senator or a member of Congress said that was false. And in doing an interview, how do you deal with that? I would say we each found our own way to do that. On the air, one method is to report something and then to say, there's no evidence to bear that out. You follow it up with a clarifying or a factual statement. But in the moment, during a live interview, it is challenging, because if you're talking to someone who is making one statement after another that can't be borne out with the facts, then you may have to make a decision. Are you going to stop and challenge every comment, or are you going to pick one out and go back on that, and say, you just said so-and-so, we know so-and-so to be the case. And we had to be thoughtful about it. But the bottom line is, certainly at the NewsHour, our view is that we are not about giving people a platform to say things unchallenged that are false. There needs to be a way to put information or a statement in context. And I'm saying this recognizing that it's not always completely clear what's exactly true. People can look at the same set of statistics, whether it's immigration numbers or healthcare, and come away with different impressions. And so there's room for that. But in stating that something happened which didn't happen, or that a number is different from the actual number, we believe we have a responsibility. But I'm not going to stand here and tell you that it's been easy. It is challenging every day. And I salute my colleagues at the NewsHour and all my colleagues in journalism who are trying to report the news as faithfully as they can, to do it in a way that respects all the American people, no matter how they voted, and to do it, as I say, in a respectful way, but in a way that recognizes when something is said that is not accurate, that it's corrected. But I'm not going to tell you that it's easy. It's not. Somebody had a hand back there, and here's a hand over here. Yeah.
The second hand back here first.
Go right ahead.
Hi. I was wondering how you and your team found the people or the groups that you have interviewed and will continue to interview around the country.
Thank you. That's such a great question. I give so much credit to my producers. I'm very lucky to work with 3 amazing producers. So much of it is, in fact, the whole thing is organic. We started out just honestly scanning the news, reading books, talking to people who were had already spent time studying and researching America's political divisions. For example, when we started at the Pew Research Center, we wanted to go to the people who've done the most credible research on all this. But pretty quickly, we realized that there were things happening around the country that we wanted to focus on. For example, and some of it was personal. I wanted to go to Tulsa because I knew 100 years after the terrible Greenwood massacre, I knew there was an effort by this young Republican mayor, G.T. Bynum, to try to bring the community together, but he was having a difficult time. It turned out to be that was a really fertile place to go to look, because it is an example of a community with a leader in the community who's trying to bring people together, but who is finding it difficult. And in some of these cases, I think I'd love to go back and see where things are a year later or a year and a half later. In other cases, the Tennessee 11 story, that was in the news, and then we heard about this group called Starts With Us. We wanted to go there. The Hispanic voters we interviewed in Phoenix. We just knew we knew the Hispanic vote is divided this year. The Hispanic community is not monolithic, and we wanted to go to a city where we could find 2 people and sit down and spend a few hours talking to each one of them about where they're coming from, to try to understand, you're both Hispanic, but there the similarity ends. They have very, very, very different views about this country. The gentleman came from Cuba. The woman's family came from Mexico. They have completely different views about from that perspective. And so many more. We wanted to look at the news media because, as I've mentioned, the media we think is a big part of why we're so divided. And so we went to profile the startup news organization called Mississippi Today. I mentioned how many newspapers have gone out of business around America. The number is just breathtakingly tragic, in my view. But they've raised enough money with philanthropy and other models, subscription, to have a startup in Mississippi, and they've begun to do some reporting that's won awards. And the reason that matters is because research is now showing that in communities where there's a loss of local journalism, the community becomes more divided. People don't know what other people are doing, and I'll just give you a quick example. We went to the panhandle of Texas, a small town called Canadian, which for decades had a newspaper called the Canadian Record. And this one woman who had been there, I guess Lori Brown, had been editing the paper for maybe 35 years. She inherited it from her father. And she had a small staff. She could barely keep it going. This is a community of 2,000 people. She was putting out a 46-page weekly newspaper every week. She had to shut it down about a year ago. We went around the community, very conservative community politically. And I will never forget the conversation I had with this deeply conservative rancher who was in tears telling me how sad he was that the Canadian Record had gone away. He said, "This is the paper that has been the glue in our community. This is the place where I've read about my children and my grandchildren. Their high school football games, you read about births, marriages, deaths, traffic stops, the the police blotter who got picked up for speeding or having too much to drink, and he was very emotional about it. And his is just one example. I mean, across the country, we are losing these local storytellers. And I mean, to the reason we're all together tonight to talk about words and to talk about language, those local papers are often the way people speak to each other, communicate with each other, know each other. And we had people in this community say, "I don't know who's running for city council." And you may say, "Well, it's just a small town, 2,000 people, it's mostly rural." That's right, but it's part of America, and there are so many other parts of the country like that. So to answer your question, it's organic. I mean, right now I've got a pile of papers in my study at home of ideas that people have sent me for places that we still haven't gotten to. And so I really mean it. If you have ideas, please share them. Please share them with me. Thank you. Question over here. Yeah, this gentleman. Yeah, either one.
Thank you so much. I was thinking about, the division starts in the home. Now we see division on college campuses. And it feels like the corporate sector and the workplace could be the next place where we see a lot of this. People who have very different political opinions work side by side. And as the temperature goes up, it could play out. So I'm curious if you've sort of thought about that. And then, obviously business has really tried to stay out of this, and it's going to be increasingly difficult. So how do you see that playing out in the world of work?
Yeah, that's really a great question. I won't pretend that I've done deep reporting on that. What I can tell you is that a conversation, actually a long interview I had with Jamie Dimon, who's the head of JP Morgan Chase, and somebody who's really respected in the finance banking community. He very carefully and was being criticized for not taking a position. There were people clamoring because there was a suspicion that he might be pro-Harris. We don't know because he hasn't said publicly. There was some reporting that privately he was, even though publicly he was signaling something slightly different. But it was clear to me after talking to him that folks in business, no matter how much heat they may get, and they have gotten and will continue to get heat for not taking a stand at times, that they worry a lot about what you just said, that if they take a position, then it signals something to their employees and becomes a subject of not just discussion, but I'm working for a company that believes X or Y, and therefore I'm on that side or I'm not on that side. And they are trying to focus on the business of doing business. You could say the bottom line, however you want to describe it. But and again, I know this not just from talking to Mr. Diamond, but also to some others, a few other business folks I've talked to about this, who've said it's just not in our interest to weigh in. Now, does that mean that there aren't tensions in the ranks of these companies? We know there are. I've heard the stories, I'm sure you have too, where people are working side by side, whether it's a bank, a law firm, a nonprofit, whatever kind of company it is, where people have different views. And depending on where they are, they could be in New York, they could be in Dallas, San Francisco, Los Angeles. We sort of make assumptions about parts of the country. If you're in LA or San Francisco, we assume you're all liberal. If you're in Texas, we assume you're all conservative, unless you're in Austin. And if you're in New York or Boston, and so on and so on. But you don't know. There are conservatives working in Austin and in New York and in Boston. And there are liberals who were in Dallas and St. Louis and other parts of the country, and in North Dakota, for that matter. So I mean, that's my perception of what goes on, about why. It doesn't really answer your question about whether we're going to see more divide. I don't know. I think it will depend too on the issues that come up. I mean, if this new administration truly does take dramatic steps, for example, to deport immigrants, and goes into communities and does, and we don't know if they will or not, but if they do, I could imagine if businesses are impacted directly by that you would see more people making comments about it. Yes, way back over there, and then here.
Judy, you're a great journalist, and you described the situation, I'll say perfectly. But when you talk to these groups and you get opinions, that the other side is all evil, I don't suppose that you can respond to that. I mean, you have to remain neutral. You can't say, well, you're not correct, or these facts that you follow are not correct. That's a very difficult position. I mean, here you're preaching to the converted. I think can you preach to the deplorables with the same talk?
First of all, they're not deplorables. They're not deplorables. I do disagree with you about that.
I'm not saying that. That was said.
No, I understand. You were using that as a device. It depends on the situation. If it is what we call focus group, with these focus groups, I was working with a really amazing young woman named Pat. Why am I drawing? You know who I'm talking about. She works with Bulwark, and I've just drawn up Sarah Longwell. Sorry, I'm thinking about Patty. Sarah Longwell. She is kind of incredible. She's a Republican. She's a longtime Republican, but very much anti-Trump. And she started, I guess, sometime in 2021, doing focus groups all over the country with Republican voters, trying to understand whether there was any way to read their thinking that would inform the anti-Trump Republicans about how to approach them on issues with arguments. And it grew to be a big thing. I mean, they started this very popular podcast now called The Bulwark. She's the founder of it. They do podcasts all the time. Again, they're all conservative Republicans, but they are anti-Trump Republicans. She's turned it into kind of a mini industry, and because she's become very good at sitting down with voters and identifying, she works with a team that goes out and does analysis of how to find voters and put a truly representative cross-section of voters together in a community. Because she wanted to go to swing states, swing areas, swing districts, and put these groups together and understand where they were coming from. Long story short, we worked with Sarah. So Sarah was the one at the focus group sitting with these people And I was in the control room watching, and she knew what questions I wanted asked, and she had a few questions of her own. I was asking for crossroads questions, which means, what do you think about the division? What do you think about people on the other side, and so on? But in that situation, when you're with a focus group and they're all pro-Trump Republicans or they're all Democrats, it's not the place where you're gonna challenge people, because you're trying to draw them out to get them to tell you what they're thinking. If I'm interviewing someone who says something that is, for example, the woman in Massachusetts, who in the Boston suburbs, who I think she said in one of her comments to me, and I can't remember, frankly, whether we put this on camera or not, whether we used it in the final edited piece, but she said something along the lines of millions of people are crossing the border who've broken the law. And I said, well, actually, there aren't millions of people. There are some, and those numbers are documented. But I can't pretend to tell you that I changed her mind. I mean, she had her opinion based on all the information that she's taken in. As I think I suggested earlier, it is our responsibility to call out blatant, to call out statements that are just not right, not accurate. When you're talking with a voter, the question is, how smart is it? How wise are you? How productive is it? How responsible are you? How responsible is it? Is it your responsibility? Thank you. To call them on it and to challenge them on it. I mean, there are conversations, if I'm interviewing or talking with an elected official, that's one thing. If I'm talking to a voter and I'm asking them what they think and why they think it, it's not so productive for me to challenge everything they say. And you may disagree with that, but in the kind of conversation when I'm trying to get people to open up, and I will challenge to a point or call out what they're saying if I'm talking to someone who's saying things that are inaccurate. But if somebody makes a statement about Donald Trump's the greatest president we ever had, I'm not gonna, I mean, that's their personal opinion. I don't know if I answered your question. Yes, a couple of hands, 3 hands, 4 hands back here, 5 hands, okay.
So just like Trump, I'm right here.
Here you are,
Avoided the interview with 60 Minutes, do we not suspect that he will just avoid news outlets that will fact check or push back? And then won't that create an atmosphere, I think we're already seeing that, where people will try to curry favor in order to get access?
Honestly, I think we don't know what he's going to do. I think it's possible that he will continue in the pattern of not talking with what I call mainstream news organizations. I certainly hope that's not the case. I hope he opens himself up for interviews. I'm sure he'll hold news conferences and will take questions from, the way the White House press operation works, he calls on the Associated Press and Reuters and, the main so-called mainstream news.
But it's going to be a period where journalists, it's going to be a very combative time.
Well, there will be challenging questions posed, no question. But you're right. I mean, he did earlier on give interviews to mainstream news organizations, but he, as you saw at the end of the campaign, they thought it was the smart thing to do the podcasts and the radio call-in shows, and it turned out it didn't hurt. I mean, he ended up winning, narrow margin. But they were very, very focused on those swing states and who the voters were they were trying to pull out. And he did increase his vote from 2020. I believe he had 74 million votes roughly in 2020, and I believe now it's around 79. So he did increase by about 5 million votes. The Democrats did well too. Kamala Harris, I think, is going to end up with 76 million. That's down from Biden's 81 million. But the Trump campaign was very, very smart in the end about the people they targeted. Yeah, this gentleman right here has had his hand up.
I'm watching PBS NewsHour since I was a kid. I've always enjoyed it. Just want to give that forward.
Thank you.
My question is, there's a lot of polarized television, news television shows, either conservative or liberal or whatever. From what I've seen, are there any shows that, or has there ever have you ever what would be the barriers to starting a show that would have liberal and conservative pundits on the same show, where they kind of just discuss things frankly and kind of like talked it out and stuff. And I don't know, it might seem a little bit controversial. I don't know if there's a show that exists that's like that, but it just seems like an interesting concept, and it's a good way to discuss, and I'm sorry, I'm going to cut you off. It's a good way to, it seems like kind of talking like from one side to another side. It's a good way to solve problems in general.
A very prominent conservative named William F. Buckley used to do that. He had a very successful, very popular series on PBS where he would argue. It would be a civil debate, and they raised their voices just slightly, but they would have a civil discussion. I mean, I think of a program, my husband's a journalist, Al Hunt, used to be with the Wall Street Journal and then with Bloomberg News for maybe a decade. He did a program with Bob Novak, renowned conservative columnist. It was Evans and Novak, Rolly Evans and Bob Novak. It was a panel show on CNN where they would bring on, and it would be Novak, who's very conservative, Mark Shields, who's more in the Democratic, certainly more in the Democratic column. My husband happens to be a journalist, but at the time he was a columnist, so he was leaning more in the Democratic direction. And then they would alternate having another progressive and a conservative columnist on with them. It was either now I'm not going to remember, Margaret Carlson, and I'm not going to remember the name of the conservative, my apologies, but they would do that. And then they would have a guest on, a Republican or a Democrat. And it was a lively, interesting back and forth. And that went on for 10 or 12 years. There have been programs like that. And you do see on the networks today, I mean, you see they will put a panel together of left and right. I watch the Sunday shows often, the Sunday interview shows, and they'll have a panel with some reporters and then some left and some right. I would hope that there's always room for that kind of conversation where people do exactly what we're here talking about tonight. Listen to each other, respond, disagree, but disagree respectfully without calling the other person terrible names. I mean, that's the part that's changed, this idea that the other person isn't just wrong, but they're immoral, that there's something wrong with them. They don't deserve to live. These kinds of horrible statements that are made. I mean, I'm sure you all look at social media, you see some of the ugly things that are shared all the time. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get away from that? I worry so much about what social media has done. It's opened the floodgates, and I don't see any turning back. The technology companies don't want to be regulated, and I don't even know that that's a good idea. It would have to be done very, very carefully. But I'm all for it. I mean, if somebody wants to come up with that kind of program, I would watch it. Anybody else? There's several hands in the back.
One last question.
One last question.
I'm actually kind of glad I'm last. Thank you so much, ma'am. This has been very informative. I just want to go back to that Lincoln quote that you used earlier in your talk. Having gone across the country, having talked to many different people, do you find still that we have more in common than we don't, despite all the noise? Is the common ground still there, or have we moved away from that?
Well, I think what we still have in common is that we all love this country and that, that we want the best for this country. We love our families. We want our families to be safe. We want the best for our children, for the people we love. And we want freedom. We love freedom. There are just essential elements of our democracy that I believe people still share. But we have gotten to a place where what we're arguing about are things like what have been raised up by our political leaders. We're arguing about immigration, the extent to which there's too much of it. And yes, we are arguing about the economy. Many people said that was the main reason they voted the way they did. I think we're still looking at exactly what does that really mean? I mean, on paper, the economy is doing better. The statistics show the economy is doing better, but many people aren't feeling that. They're still, they know that it costs more to go and buy a gallon of gas or a loaf of bread or a quart of milk than it did 4 years ago. And they blame the person or the administration in office. So when the focus is on these things, I think some scholars have said when you get to a point of comfort, meaning we feel free enough and in a sense comfortable enough to be able to argue about these things, for people to be able to argue about the best way to educate their kids, and to, and frankly, some of these arguments are about people's fear for their children. The fear that immigrants are going to change the country, and I don't want my children going to school with children like that. I don't want, and the whole gender identity question, which we haven't even talked about, the so-called woke story. So I think fundamentally Americans have a lot in common. We do love this country. We do care about our survival. We would, if God forbid there were an attack from the outside on the country, as there was at 9/11, Americans came together for a brief moment. It lasted, not even quite a year, as it turned out, because there were arguments about whether we were going to go into Iraq. But if we were attacked, I think Americans would come together. I certainly want to believe that. So I do believe there's a lot we have in common. And we have a right to disagree. A democracy means we should be able to disagree, but not in a way that denigrates and cuts down and frankly is contemptuous of people on the other side. And that's what I think is tragic, and that we can't, I think, just stand by as this gets worse and worse and worse. I think we have to take a stand and do something about it, and know that we as individuals can make a difference. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.